Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. I hope you're having a wonderful week, and I hope you enjoy this week's reading. This is the second part of the books. We're going to talk about Black creators, we're going to talk about Black superheroes in the context of Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Black Panther. As always, all borrowed images and quoted text are used for educational purposes. I'm not trying to make a buck off of this, I'm just trying to hold a class. I want to connect to week 3 and Wortham's seduction of the innocent. One of the things that people talked about in some of their responses was the fact that, dismemberment and beheadings and some of the grisly stuff that Wortham condemned probably shouldn't happen in the pages of comic books. And I'm willing to say that that's fine. You can certainly hold that opinion. I do want to point out, however, that Wortham also condemned the panels that you see on the left and the cover that you see on the right. They too were going to cause juvenile delinquency. For Wortham, the fact that the body on the panel on the left showed a little exposed thigh was the reason it shouldn't be available to the public. And apparently, the Phantom Lady was too scantily clad, and the fact that there were ropes involved would somehow appeal to prurient interests and create all sorts of scandal. I think that in this case, Wortham perhaps just was going a bit too far. And I think it's important to remember that censorship oftentimes maybe starts out with we're going to actually protect someone, but frequently goes too far. To tie it to this week, both of the panel and the cover were created by African American artists. And Griffin worked to pass as white during segregation. This created some controversy during the time. And I think it's important to understand that it was a complex situation. And he made the choice, and people reacted to it on both sides. People were trying to keep people from passing as white, keeping segregation as tight as possible, and African Americans understandably were upset that he's denying his heritage. Baker drew a character named Vuda, and Vuda had his own weird issue with segregation and passing as white. He was the first black hero to be given his own feature in a white comic book. He was drawn as white-skinned on the covers because in the South they would not put a black character on the cover. They would not put that book on the newsstand. And eventually he's drawn as a white-skinned character throughout the books, like most of the Jungle books. And if you want more about this, there's a book entitled Invisible Men, the unknown black creators of comics. I highly recommend it. That's where this information came from. Jumping to black superheroes in general. There's been relatively few. The Black Panther was probably the first widely known, and I want to emphasize the term widely known, and the first African American that's at least called the first African American would have been the Falcon, who is now Sam Wilson, Captain America in some of the books. So you have these statements, and technically, because it's often called widely known, I think they're technically correct. However, in the newspaper strips in 1934, there was a character named Lothar. And Lothar seems to still be going on. I haven't checked newspaper comic strips for a long time, but apparently the character still appears. More interestingly, there was a comic called All Negro Comics. There was one issue. And the video, one of the videos you're going to listen to, the supplementary viewing thing, there's an 8 to 10 minute explanation of why there was only one issue. It was all black creators, Orrin Evans and his brother, and 3 others. And Evans was a journalist, and he was enthusiastic about glorifying, as he says on the page, Negro historical achievements. And I think it's important to understand that we have Lion Man, who's the superhero. We have Ace Harlem, who was a detective. And we have Sugarfoot and Snake Roll as the wandering Negro minstrel of the past. He's trying to create a broad base of comic book characters. Recently, this book came out with enhanced art, digitally enhanced art. There was a Kickstarter for it. And I think it's important to understand that this might be one of the most important comics and one of the most underrated comics that has ever been published. Lion Man. On the previous page, you notice that Lion Man was 2 words. Up here, it seems like it's only 1. So I'm going to just go with 1. And you'll notice that he was a scientist, that he was going to protect uranium, enough to make an atom bomb that could destroy the world, that he was fighting a treacherous nation who was going to use the lethal stuff for the purpose of war. And he's doing it not for the United States, but for the United Nations. Ace Harlem. Ace Harlem was a police detective. It's my favorite story in the book. And fingerprints, questioning the witness, examining the body, all of those things that were part of the Dick Tracy, police detective, detective fiction. He does all of those exceptionally well. Also, it's a product of the time. The language and the zoot suit or the zoot chain. The zoot suit was a man's suit. Exaggerated the style, high-waisted, baggy trousers, narrowing at the cuffs, long draped coat. And the zoot chain was part of the accoutrement that went with the zoot suit. Sugarfoot. I don't know enough about the Negro minstrel shows to comment one way or the other. But I will note that in the very first panel, this is a heck of a way to start life into comics. He knows he's in a comic. In short, he is breaking the fourth wall. And the fourth wall is a big deal in the She-Hulk comics. It's a big deal in the Deadpool comics, and this character was doing it in 1947. I want to point out that the Black Panther was not even the first character with a title. Dell Comics produced Lobo in 1965, 7 months before the Black Panther. Dell Comics isn't one of the big 2, and I don't know if Dell Comics exists anymore. When I was a kid, though, Dell Comics was kind of a standard in the spinner racks or on the shelves in the various drugstores and in the various grocery stores or whatever that stocked comics before comic book shops became a thing. And so I think it's important to remember that even though it's not Marvel, it's not DC or Image or any of the comic book companies that still are standing, Dell Comics in the 1960s was an important part of the comic book industry. Let's move on to the Black Panther now. First of all, when I used this book in an adolescent lit class, one of the questions was, what's the relationship between the Black Panther and the Black Panthers? The Black Panther appeared several months before Seal and Newton set up the Black Panthers. It hit the grocery store spinner racks in June or May, Seal and Huey Newton formed the uh, Black Panther Party for Self Defense in October. And so there really isn't a connection. I seriously doubt that Bobby Seale or Huey Newton read the Black Panther and determined that it was a character that they wanted to take the name of. I also want to talk about the author because there's this weird connection. Ta-Nehisi Coates' father served as the chairperson of the Maryland Black Panther Party. So even if there wasn't a connection between the name of the book and the name of the Black Panther Party, there's a connection between Coates and the Black Panthers. And I think it's important to remember. I talked about Mosley, who wrote detective fiction. Coates is a public intellectual. The book Between the World and Me is a very influential book about how Black people interact with white America. He has written influential articles called The Case for Reparations, and he's also written fiction. And he's written the Captain America book, he's written the Black Panther book. He's a public intellectual who has come over and has written fiction and has written comics. And finally, I think we're just going to go through character, conflict, connection, and theme. We have some direct characterization. Reed Richards in the Fantastic Four, issue 52, page 20, where the Black Panther made his first appearance, talks about the honor of the Black Panther. He doesn't give his word lightly, nor does he give his dishonor it once it's given. We have characterization through his mother. You acted beyond what a king should, giving yourself for a world. In other words, he wasn't being a good king. He was going beyond what a king should, and he should be giving himself for the nation as the queen did, not Queen Ramonda, but his sister. There's also internal conflicts. The idea that he's never given himself for his country because he believes people are a burden. And he's worried about Shuri and how long he's going to be separated from her and how he can bring her back. And he's divided from his own people. All of those things are internal conflicts. Certainly, there are external conflicts. There's plenty of fight scenes. He's trying to defeat death. He's fighting Zenzi, he's fighting Tetu, he's fighting Stain. The early part of the book talk about battles with Doom, battles with Namor, Namor. All of those things are a big chunk of the external conflicts in this book and drive the book. But remember that conflicts and characterization matter because they create, or at least are important elements of creating the theme of the book. I also want to talk about the poetry in the book. I think there's some beautiful language. The ancestors slept in my outstretched limbs and listened to flesh praying and entreating on his knees. And I think the art is gorgeous, stark, and beautiful as we're dealing with the poetry. And poetry and myth are creating a modern narrative, according to Coates, of the diaspora before and after colonialism and enslavement. So he's trying to go back to that time when colonial powers enslaved Africans and sent them all over the world. And also, he's trying to connect it to the comics. It's a romance, and it's not that different than the romance you'd see in Marvel's Thor. I just pulled a clip or a screenshot of a recent Thor book With every cry drowned and every tear hidden, the thunder of an orphaned and wrathful God dances gently across the stars. There's a certain poetic language to that. More importantly, comic book writing, like poetry, requires a ruthless efficiency with words. I think that that's true of all writing. I think all writing should be concise. I think all writing should be active. And sorry for the digression here, but that ruthless efficiency that poetry asks for, that Coates Condensed comic book writing asks for, should be writing that you produce as well. A lot of you have received comments from me talking about be more concise. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. And then finally, just a quick reminder, the art is amazing. And the art, I think, is ruthlessly efficient as well in the scenes with the poem Root Song. And finally, to connect it to this week's book, Death is Not Permanent. We're dealing with the idea we're going to bring Shuri back. Moving on, I want to make a connection to a non-lit term. Terroir. Terroir is something that wine producers talk about, and it's the idea that the soil, the topography, the climate, the natural environment that produced the grapes that eventually got turned into the wine are an important element of the wine. The natural environment in this fictional world, Wakanda, is important to the book. People will contend that Wakanda is a character as much as any of the other characters in the book are. First of all, it's this technologically advanced African nation. It was never taken over by European colonists, so it is unique in that aspect. Also remember, it's technologically advanced, but it was hidden for decades, if not centuries. And so its technology and its advancement differ from the advancement and technology of the Western world. Again, the idea that it's the biggest characters in the series. There's a duality of old world and city of the future, the juxtaposition of a strong culture and heritage, but a schism within that. And that culture and heritage is a reminder that the king and the country were one. And if the T'Challa falls, the country falls. The country will rupture. That sense of terroir, that sense of connecting the land to the characters, that this character is part of that natural environment, I think is key to the book. And so, yes, I'm taking a term, I'm using it in a way it was not intended, but I think it's an important way to look at this book and see why the place is important. A lot of Marvel places are New York. A lot of Marvel places are real cities, fictionalized, but real cities. This fictional place, I think, is important. And finally, you've got the idea that the characters are the blood alloy of the country themselves, and that the king who's broken is connected to a broken place. Coates brings that up, not just in the art on the previous slide, but he also brings it up here. He's confident he's not a broken dude, or not completely broken. I'd argue that there's a bit of a break there. He's interested in whether he should be king. He's interested in what that relationship to the other character, Wakanda, should be. Finally, I want to talk about the public intellectual as a writer. Because I've tried to contend throughout this class that the superhero genre is not just a kid's genre. We talk about death, we talk about dying, we talk about free will, we talk about philosophy, we talk about a lot of stuff. This review of the book argues that Coates challenges the superhero genre to think in complex ways about nation states, democracy, individual power, in autocrats. In other words, to think about politics. I want to tie that back to week one when we talked about the Katzenjammer Kids and the idea that they changed their name because of politics, that people didn't like them because the Katzenjammer Kids all got into trouble every week, and every week they were punished, and the punishment didn't take because the next week they did the same thing. There was a political as well as moral tone to that situation. Coates is trying to move beyond simple right and wrong to add some complexity. We talked about nuance with the supervillain Kingpin. I think the same sort of nuance is here. Once again, leave a comment. Here's a few suggestions. Is Wakanda actually a character? Coates seems to say it is. I think it is. You can explain why you don't think so. Should someone try to update Lion Man or Ace Harlem? Explain why. What do you think of the poem? And go beyond just the 2 panels I have on the slide and make your own connections. I think that that's always an option. It's something I think everybody should try to do. It's something I hope reading does for everyone. Very quickly, I didn't say this in the first one. I'm going to say it now. There's going to be comments on all 3 videos, but I'm not going to have you do a daily writing. The comment on video 3 will be the daily writing for this week. I hope it lessens your workload just a little bit. And I hope everybody has a good week. And I hope, once again, that some point here you've found a bit of joy or something's been a little bit educational and you've been asked to think in a new way.